one of the things that's often misunderstood, or probably coming from a legacy view of what the term zero-based budgeting is, and we often see at clients and often in our own world that what we think of zero-based budgeting isn't always what it is. And I think for the next 45 minutes or an hour, we want to take you through what our understanding of zero-based budgeting is, what it actually is and what it isn't, and give you the opportunity to talk you through a real life examples, and then give you the opportunity to ask some questions. So I think the first thing that I just want you to keep in the back of your mind is zero-based budgeting isn't what you think it is. And with that, we'll go into what is it then if it isn't what we think it is. Okay, Bernard, if you can then take us through what zero-based budgeting is.
Yeah, thanks for that, Renelle. So I think the very important point we want to land here is that it is much more sophisticated than just managing your cost or managing your back office costs. So the way we see it, there are two elements for long-term value creation, which is cost control and revenue growth. And we see ZBB as a sophisticated tool that can enable cost, or the back office cost, to enable revenue growth. So ultimately what we want to achieve is not only to remove inefficiencies from the back office and not project them forward, but also to create a connection, a relationship between the back office and the front office, so that the cost is much more dynamic and it enables revenue growth and it enables better capital allocation over time. So, I mean, what we want to say here is that ZBB is a very sophisticated tool that should give you a competitive advantage in a very competitive world that we currently live in. So through enhanced visibility and transparency that comes from the ZBB process, because inevitably there's going to be a lot of modeling that happens in order to find a baseline with zero inefficiency. You do create sort of an early warning system whereby unfavorable influences can be detected and identified ahead of time, so that you can understand your business cycle better, or you can understand your profit margins better and what effect your costs have on them. But I think ultimately what we want to say before we get into the detail of ZBB is that this is much more sophisticated than just controlling costs, and we hope we can demonstrate that today.
Yeah, I think maybe just to add to that, Bernard, this is really a tool that can help drive the way we do our business, the way we increase our revenue and control our costs. Not that it's only controlling our costs, but it's something that could be a very valuable tool in the way we see and drive our business going forward.
Yeah, exactly. So I think with that in mind, we see ZBB not as a bottom-up or a top-down exclusively. We see it as a top-down and bottom-up. So you look sort of at all angles at your costs so that you can get the most out of it. So if you consider this table on the left, a great way to start the ZBB process from a top-down perspective is to understand your cost. What is the cause of the cost and what is its effect on revenue? So if you consider the first bucket would be not required. So for example, this might be legacy systems in banks that's been around for 40 years, which is not giving you any sort of competitive advantage. It's very expensive, and it's something that you should be ruthless on when it comes to ZBB. So if possible, it's advisable to eliminate that completely. Otherwise, be very, very harsh in terms of removing inefficiencies and finding that zero base. We'll go through an example of how to get there. Secondly is lights on, which is not, it's much more relevant than your legacy systems as an example, but it's also not something that gives you a competitive advantage. So it's also a cost bucket that you want to be fairly ruthless on when it comes to ZBB. Be very, very direct when you look for that zero base and remove inefficiencies, because it's also not a cost that gives you a competitive advantage. And thirdly is table stakes, which is similar to lights on, but it's a bit more relevant towards your front office and enabling your revenue growth. An example of this would be accounting or web-based self-service in an insurance context. But this is something that you don't want to be as ruthless on, because this might be something that gives you some sort of competitive advantage. So if you think about this ZBB process holistically, you want to be very ruthless in terms of ZBB in your first two buckets, and then sort of look to invest in number 3 and 4. So number 4 being your differentiating activities, which, for example, a bank would be its app or its targeted marketing campaigns. So the idea of ZBB would be to remove the inefficiency from the first buckets and then sort of invest them towards 3 and 4, and sort of continue doing this process over and over again on an annual basis in order to drive your competitive advantage and make sure that your costs are actually serving you and actually are sort of directed towards revenue growth and profitability, and not just sort of siloed and sitting in the background.
I think just to add to that, exactly what we were saying in the beginning, right? Often people think zero-based budgeting is starting with a clean page and just thinking what is our budget for the next year going to be, and that starting from a zero base. And what it actually is not is, it is actually not that. What it is looking at what is our baseline that we start with. We're identifying the categories that Bernard spoke about now. What are some of the things that's not required that are legacy that is coming into our plan? What are some of the things that kind of keeps the lights on but can be minimized? What are the table stakes or the entry tickets? And what are those differentiating activities that's really going to grow our revenue and help it basically, getting us to a more favorable position? We will get into a bit more slides a little bit later on in terms of the detail of zero-based budgeting. I think upfront, it's just worth mentioning that zero-based budgeting isn't starting with a clean slate every year. It's looking at what is my baseline, removing those inefficiencies in our baseline and building forth from that. And there are other considerations which we'll speak a bit about later on, but I think it's just worth starting with this from the beginning. And it's also about justifying costs on a continued basis, looking at it not as a once-off exercise, and then for the next 10 years, we continue budgeting on what the baseline was 10 years ago, but looking at what's relevant in the market today and what's relevant in our business today and reassessing that. And I think over the last 2 years, we've seen, even through the COVID pandemic, that becoming so much more crucial in terms of what is still relevant and what is not. Okay, so now we'll get into zero-based budgeting principles.
Okay, so that sort of takes care of the top-down strategic lens. Now what zero-based budgeting really is in practice and how to apply this. So what you really want to do fundamentally is remove inefficiencies and not project them forward over time. So like Ronel mentioned, it's not about starting from scratch. It's about taking a data-led approach, remove inefficiencies from your costs, or whatever the case may be, and not project them forward over time. So a way of saying this is you can connect your accounting with your economic reality. So often if you look at your budget from a GL perspective, it might be completely removed from what is actually happening from an economic operations perspective. And the idea of ZBB is to bring these two together so that whatever you are seeing in your GL or your finances is actually exactly what's happening on the ground operationally or from an economic perspective. And you've removed inefficiencies because you've created that visibility and transparency. So that is fundamentally what we see ZBB as. So it's about removing that inefficiency and creating that synergy between economic and accounting reality, and getting the GL in touch with the mechanics of the business, whatever the business may be. And what we found in practice is that the baseline often of clients were very, very inflated. So we found anything from 20% to 100% above what that zero efficiency ZBB baseline was, which creates a big opportunity for us, because that creates that opportunity to remove that inefficiencies, extract that value, and invest that towards your differentiating activities or whatever your vision or your mission or your agenda may be. Then lastly, one very important point is compounded growth, which is the essence of long-term value creation. So if you think about ZBB in multiple dimensions over 20 to 40 years, if you continue this process every year, we remove inefficiencies from areas that doesn't give you any sort of competitive advantage and invest them into areas that actually do. This really sets in motion the chain of compounded growth and value creation over time. So what we're saying is just fundamentally is remove inefficiencies, invest them in areas that create a competitive advantage, and do this over and over and over again in order to set in motion this chain of economic value creation.
Exactly. And I think it's, like we say there, thinking, behaving, and incentivizing differently, thinking differently about how we do about it. With that, we'll go into the fundamentals of each of the design principles.
Okay, yeah, so sort of the nitty-gritty of this is, if you think about the slide we did earlier where we looked at the cost buckets, that is taking a holistic approach to understand which costs, what are the cause of the cost, and what are its effects on revenue or profitability. So that is what we mean when we say follow a holistic approach. It's about understanding each cost before you get into the ZBB process. Then, as we mentioned earlier, the ZBB process is often misunderstood because there is sort of a concept, sort of a misperception that it is starting from zero every year, but it's much more about removing inefficiencies. So taking whatever data is required and finding that zero base, that baseline with zero inefficiencies, and sort of projecting that forward over time. Now, one line that we see as crucial in the ZBB process is to understand and distinguish between top-down budget cuts or across the board broad-based cuts versus this removing inefficiencies bottom-up approach. If you do sort of top-down cuts, broad-based cuts, it's very likely to lead to savings in the short term, but it will lead to value erosion in the long term because you may cut into areas that you should not be cutting in, areas that give you a competitive advantage. So very important to take this holistic approach and remove inefficiencies from areas that make sense and that's going to serve you in the long term, and it's sort of going to create and sustain a competitive advantage. Then we'll get into an example what the fourth point means, but basically what we're saying is break each line item down to its root cause, assign a cost object or cost driver to each area, and build it back up. So look at each activity as if it were brand new and build it back up to find that full efficiency, zero inefficiency baseline. And then lastly, before starting the process, it's advisable to re-examine your vision. Just an example of this would be if you are moving towards a cloud-based solution, you would not be zero-basing your on-prem solution. Or if you are a government and you want to be focusing on social spending or driving that sort of agenda, you would not really go into cutting any costs there. That's where you would want to invest actually. So just if you understand your vision and where you're going in the long term, it's a good way to start the ZBB process.
And just to add to that, I think when we're speaking about analyzing our costs at the root or re-examining our vision, it doesn't necessarily mean that every year when we do planning or every instance of planning that it has to be a labor-intensive process. I think there is a lot of benefits that we get from it, and there, if we look at what the crucial components are, if we think about that first slide of those specific buckets, there's a lot of benefits that can be achieved without necessarily going through a very labor-intensive process every year.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So that's also something we want to learn today, is that it can be intensive in the first year when you actually have to do modeling to get to your zero base, but the cost of not doing it is significant. And once it's in place, it sort of just repeats itself annually. But I think that's a very good point. So it's not dependent on any technology. It's a way of thinking. It's a methodology. It's completely technology agnostic. It can be done on Excel, for example. But it is, and the work in the first year may be a bit more intensive, but I mean, it's advisable to get it going because, like we said, the cost of not doing it, will far outweigh the cost of doing it. Right, so then one way that we found was a good way of starting this process is with this holistic approach in mind, is to put this lens on your spend base. Just when you think about your strategy or your vision or whatever you want to do going forward, it's sort of important to look at this lens as well. So if you broke your spend into these buckets and ask yourself which areas I want to invest in, which areas I want to zero base, but very importantly, which areas will receive some sort of opposition or will not receive buy-in, because some areas, some companies, or for example, a government may not be able to touch internal FTE from a ZBB perspective. In which case, it would be advisable to not start there because you want to get some momentum and you need buy-in from key stakeholders. So it's important to not just, go at this without considering all players involved, all stakeholders involved, and sort of consider where you might have more reasonable or realistic success in the short term, and then starting there and then moving your way towards the rest of the organization.
Yeah, I think that speaks to the point, Bernard, around having an holistic view when we look at our business, thinking about what is relevant and what is not, and how we can achieve that from our business perspective.
Yeah, again, if we can use the government example here, so you may want to actually increase your spend on social spending. In which case you might focus on your external commodities, your external services, which is basically your supply chain where you are contracting with external suppliers. You might start your ZBB process there and then remove inefficiencies and invest them into other areas like your internal FTE or your social spending, whatever the case may be. Okay, and then also if you look at it from a holistic perspective, what we found to be a sort of a key success factor with our clients was looking at this picture, where the line would be cumulative spend and the bars would be spend by line item. So we often find this asymmetry where only a few big ticket items contribute a large portion of overall spend, which sort of guides you in terms of where you should start your ZBB process. In this example, we found that the top 7 categories contributed 85% of spend. So we actually started the process there. You don't really want to start with the tail end at the right, because it's not really going to have an impact. So there might be, you might go through a lot of manual intensive work or managing certain stakeholders and not actually see any value. So you want to take this lens as well, so you can look at where the big ticket item sits and where it's actually going to have impact. So where's it really going to hit home?
Exactly. So we're overlaying this in terms of high impact versus where do we want to focus our business. And the example of the government spend social initiatives, that's where we then could also align this to. Okay, I think where this really would make sense is if we walk through a few examples or speak about zero-based budgeting in practice, what we've seen at clients and what we've seen over the last few years happening within the business.
Yeah, so this is an actual example of a commodity that was zero-based. So the first block in red would basically be the trend line is set towards the actual spend. So the graph is actual spend with a trend line, but the trend line is only set towards the first 12 months. So the red gives you an idea of where spend would be going if you just applied increases, CPI, whatever index may be relevant. And then, I mean, over time, these two lines would completely diverge. There would be a massive difference. So what we found in practice was that after a couple of months, there was a divergence that happened. So the orange line would be the actual weighted average spend of this commodity, whereas the red line is the trend line of where it would have been from a normal budgeting perspective. So what you want to achieve in practice is exactly this. You want to see this divergence happening where inefficiencies have been removed, cost is significantly lower, and this divergence, this delta between the trend line and the orange line is exactly the value that you want to extract from areas that you can extract value from and reinvest those into areas that give you a competitive advantage. The idea again is to look at this over multiple periods in multiple dimensions and think about the chain of economic value creation that's being set in motion by this. And it's purely by removing inefficiencies. Some inefficiencies are very clear and very obvious, and you see them as soon as you look at cost from a level deeper than the GL. If you just start breaking it down, other costs are much more complex and opaque, but starting the process sort of inevitably leads to this sort of divergence that happens over time.
And I think it's important to note that it's about being agile in our way of budgeting and the way we think about our business, and not having that in silos to achieve what we're seeing on the screen here.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's often a sort of a mental accounting that is applied to costs within an organization where they silo each cost and assign it to a certain area. But if you take the ZBB data-led approach, you sort of cut straight through that mental accounting, because now you look at your cost holistically. You look at removing inefficiencies from certain areas and moving it to other areas where there is sort of a tendency to not do this because silos are created for costs and it's assigned to certain areas and no one is really challenging that and moving costs around. Whereas the ZBB is sort of a powerful enabler to cut through this mental accounting and actually create value through the back office costs.
And I think it's really thinking about also, I don't know, we focus a lot on costs, and we've used the word cost often throughout the conversation, but it's really also looking at, the term of what is good costs and what are bad costs, and identifying that. And it touches on the theme in terms of looking at our business from a holistic perspective, looking at where the impact is, but also where our vision is and what we want to achieve, or start focusing on and implementing zero-based budgeting. So it's not top-down budget cuts. It's not starting from a blank piece of paper and, for the lack of better word, thumb sucking what my budget could be, or what I want my budget to be, and then we have to retrofit our business to fit into that. It's looking at the reality of what's happening in our business, closing that gap in terms of our GL and what's happening in the market or the economic environment out there, closing that gap, and achieving those efficiencies that is set out, or that we can from a business perspective. With that in mind, I think the last slide is just, if we do have any questions, who to contact. We will share this with you, but we really want to go through a practical example. So, like I said in the beginning, we have Grant, Bernard, myself, and Alex from the Namibia office that you can contact should you have any questions. I think we'll leave some time at the end as well. But as we're going through the practical example, I really want to urge everybody to, if you have a question, unmute, ask us, pause us, and we'll go through the question there and then while it's still relevant, as opposed to having to go back to a certain point at the end. I'll just pause before we go into the practical example. Any questions, comments from anyone in the panel? Alex, anything that you guys want to add?
Ronelle, it's Grant. And morning, everybody.
Sure.
And it's really great to be sharing this time with you. So I think, again, we iterate obviously on the cost drives and so on. But I think one of the important things is to look at when we take those activities. Every activity that we do today lands up as some financial cost. And if you look at it from the perspective of activities and what adds economic value to uplift revenue, and if it is something that is not doing that holistically, and you can't see the direct correlation to the uplift in revenue, the question you have to ask yourself is, how is that eroding my bottom line? And we'll often refer to EBIT as an example, right? So if you think of your equation in your mind, it is that balance that Bernard and Ronelle showed as a bit of a seesaw effect. But if everything that you think about is, in order to grow my revenue, I have to incur certain costs. What are the costs that are palatable to me, and which are the costs that I believe are not adding any economic value in those buckets? And as Bernard showed in that initial diagram, there is a significant uplift just by addressing what we call the bad cost component, which is the first 1 and 2 items in the bucket. Typically, a business can see anywhere between a 20 to 30% uplift in that net income ratio. So again, it's just something to think about. The question often is, what is the return on doing this? It is quite a complex exercise, certainly, but is there value in doing it? For sure. And you will see that in your numbers as you translate. It also takes you to a point where you provide a lot more rigor to how you think about your business and actually how you want to operate that business model. So perhaps just that's it from my side, Ronelle and Bernard, just as we move forward, just as a kind of a place to think. Thanks.
Okay, hi Ronelle, hi Grant. I just have a question? Can I ask?
Of course.
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, in practice, from what you guys have seen, when companies switch over to a zero-based budgeting approach, how does that change the dynamics of stakeholder engagement? Maybe from a finance team perspective and also from a business perspective. Is there anything that we have to think about also from that perspective? Because I think that is one of the large, one of the more time-consuming areas of budgeting is not only coming up with the figures, but actually engaging with the different stakeholders and the people who have to own the budgets after the fact. Thanks. That's it from me.
I think that's a great question. I think it's a very relevant question, and it's as we mentioned earlier, it's important to consider which areas might get some sort of opposition or some pushback, because you're right, there is a level of buy-in required from key stakeholders. So, I mean, it is definitely something to consider. Not all areas will be as receptive to this, but the idea would be to start with areas where there's gonna be buy-in. There's likely to be buy-in because everyone agrees there might be inefficiency in a certain area, which would be a great place to start. But if you know for sure that there will be pushback in certain areas, it would be advisable not to begin there, to sort of build momentum in areas where you feel you can engage certain stakeholders and there is going to be results, and there's definitely inefficiencies where everyone agree on. It's advisable to start there and then move to the more tricky, sort of more tougher stakeholder areas. But it's very important to consider.
And I think that probably adds to the point where once you start in areas where people are accepted to it, you kind of prove your concept that the value that you're getting from zero-based budgeting, and not just a tick box exercise in terms of getting your budget or forecast done at the end of the year for the next year or 3 years, but actually getting that done and thinking about the way we drive our business.
Yeah, exactly, and because it's not about budget cuts, because it's about removing inefficiency and creating synergy, you're likely to get buy-in because everyone would agree once that inefficiency is identified through this visibility that ZBB creates. You're much more likely to get that buy-in from your key stakeholders. Whereas if you go for a budget cut without really understanding what you're cutting and what your baseline is, it's likely that you will get opposition and the process will not be successful, which is why it's so important to look at ZBB as both bottom-up and top-down, and removing inefficiency, creating synergy, rather than budget cuts, because we are not really advocates for top-down budget cuts at all.
And then just to add a final point onto that, with ZBB, you're also changing the methodology by which you are planning. So you're introducing the driver-based planning concept. So you're adding a lot more meaning behind the creation of those numbers into tangible activities and results that will drive your costs and your revenues. And that's also a factor in increasing buy-in, because people are actually motivated by the creation of your budget, rather than just taking a previous year and uplifting it. So there's a lot more meaning and accountability behind the results.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. It comes down to exactly that. So once that visibility.
Sorry, but I see Cecilia's got her hand up. Cecilia, maybe just something from your side. Do you have a question? So I just noticed that there's a hand up, so I just wanted to make sure we had covered off on that. Cecilia, can you hear? You seem to have your hand up, so I just wanted to check if you had a question, perhaps. Okay. All right, looks like your hand has gone down. Okay, but again, if there is a question, you can put your hand up, or again, just feel free to unmute and ask. But Charlie, I think that's very important. You know, unfortunately, too often in business today, we just see the top-down version, right? It's something that comes from the executive suite, what we call a bit of a finger in the air. We believe you need to cut X, and that is the worst place to be for anyone trying to manage and drive budgets effectively. And I think that's why budgeting generally today has such a bad connotation. And therefore people don't necessarily apply their minds to it, because you're given a target and you will do whatever necessary and often move around cost items to get to an end result which is palatable at an executive level, or let's say the stakeholder level, which I suppose, given today's very dynamic environment, the world in which we live, COVID and others notwithstanding, just the dynamicism of the business in which we operate, it does actually force us to rethink our business on a continuous basis. And that's the agility that we need to think through. So budgeting is certainly not a once-off. Planning is not a once-off. And therefore, the concept and the approach to ZBB finds itself more relevant in today's way of work. Bernard, back to you.
Thanks, Grant. So I think, Alex, if you're comfortable that we go ahead with the practical example now, or would you like to take a 5-minute break?
I think we can continue, Bernard.
Okay, great.
Bernard, sorry, I see Chalwa's got a hand up.
Good morning. Just ignore, I'm not sure what's happening here. I'm trying to put it down. I didn't really raise my hand up.
No
Not a
worries.
problem at all, Chalwa. Okay, thank you.
Let's just continue.
Okay, great. So we just want to go through a couple of practical examples, and what we want to show is more the methodology of creating or removing inefficiencies and how we go about this, considering the slide deck we just presented. So traditionally, companies would look at their budget from this perspective.
While we wait for Bernard to start, I think what's important to note is Bernard mentioned in the beginning that we can think the ZBB as a way of thinking, and it's not necessarily having to have very expensive technologies implemented, etc. We've done this example for the purposes of this session. We've done an example in Power BI, and we'll show you all of the benefits without having specific expensive technologies implemented to be able to get to a point where we can see the benefit of ZBB.
Yeah, exactly. So we want to show that it's much more of a methodology that can be done in something like Excel or Power BI, as opposed to investing in some expensive platform. Okay, so normally the first way to look at your budget would be from this perspective, where you look at a GL line item with no cost drivers or data behind us. It's just a one-liner, and then it's sort of escalated over time. So if you look at the rent example, it sort of moved from 60 all the way to 93. And the idea would be to go into more detail to understand that much better and what's driving that. So where you want to get, like we mentioned earlier, is to this point where you start to see this divergence between where your normal budgeting would have taken you versus where the ZBB actually took you. So in this example, again, the blue trend line would be where the normal budgeting methodology ended up, whereas the red line is the actual price movements and where the ZBB process ended up. So we did about 5 examples here. What we want to show you is not everything is equally successful or equally inefficient. Some areas are much more inefficient and creates a lot more value, whereas others like this example here was perfectly zero-based already. We found that even spending time on this didn't make sense because it's sort of moving with the trend either way. So there was nothing to be done about this. Okay, then we're going to start off with a very simple example and then sort of work our way to more complex stuff. So if you consider the rent example, specifically with a hybrid working model in mind, where you move towards sort of working from home versus working from the office or splitting your time, whatever the case may be. So instead of looking at your rent from a 93.8 million on the GL as a one-liner, look at it from how many square meters of corporate real estate are you renting, and what is your weighted average cost per square meter. So looking at it from this perspective sort of gives you an opportunity to look at where there might be inefficiencies and where you can extract value.
Also looking at what is in our GL, having that as our starting point. So looking at the rent example, what is coming through from our GL, but not looking at our GL in isolation. So closing that gap that we spoke about in the beginning in terms of what is happening in our GL and what's happening in the economic environment out there. Rent being a very good example of the new hybrid way of working that we're seeing across the globe, where we were not necessarily predominantly in the office 5 days a week anymore and having a hybrid way of working. So it's looking at how can we use that then to our advantage and closing the gap in terms of the inefficiencies there.
Exactly. So in this example, we chose this example specifically because it's so topical right now. So you might want to move towards a 80% utilization model where you say 4 days is office and 1 day is from home, which means you completely change how many square meters of corporate real estate you're renting. So for this client, for example, was across South Africa as a whole. So this would take the 625 down to 500 because you would sort of change the way you enter into contracts because you are actually reducing your capacity that you want. And because you are creating this visibility and changing your capacity, you also need to look at your cost per square meter. So you might find that 150 is actually not competitive. It might be too high, so you might negotiate this down to, let's say, 137, which means your 93 million ends up at 69 million. And this sort of now is perfectly aligned to where you want to go as an organization. You're looking at what are you paying per square meter and how many square meters are you using. This is an example of removing inefficiencies from a cost and utilization perspective. Again, this would also change the way that you contract. So we mentioned in the presentation that you're thinking and behaving differently. In this example, you would not be just looking at your rent as a cost, as a one-liner, but you would be looking when you enter into negotiations, you would be looking at these two KPIs specifically and negotiating on them and linking that to where you want to go as an organization.
Yeah, I think, and it's also not just about necessarily always renegotiating. It's also looking at, if I think of for instance, a government example, we might have quite a lot of offices that are redundant at the moment. So it's looking at where is the best place, which of the offices are still needed in the way that we're working now, and which of those can be rented out or for additional revenue, or we don't have to rent those space anymore, so saving on our costs as well. So it's not always just about renegotiating contractual rates. It's about looking at the holistic view of what do we have, or what do we need to make what we need to make.
Then a slightly more complex one is one we did for a company that was very heavily was spending very heavily on commodities. Now, a commodity could be anything from PPE or cleaning equipment or something complex in the context of a mine, where it could be something mechanical engineering item or whatever the case may be. But the idea would be to not look at commodities as a one-liner on the GL, but to break that GL into whatever commodities makes up that line. So we found, for example, that a one-liner on a GL might have 7 different commodities that feed into that line, but they have vastly different cost drivers behind them, and they are very different in terms of how they enable production or growth. So the idea would be to not look at that one-liner GL, but to create the additional visibility and look at your consumption of that commodity and the unit price of that specific commodity and zero base it from that perspective. So for this example, we looked at the commodity consumption and we forecasted that over time. The reason you do this is it sort of creates the opportunity for you to mute price increases, because if you understand your consumption over time, you have an opportunity to buy at favorable times. If you consider Apple for an example, they might have a very heavy spend on steel. And if they can forecast their steel for 5 or 10 years, track the steel price, and then buy at favorable times, it's going to make a massive difference to what they spend overall, versus just projecting a 6 or 7% or whatever the steel price movement is on the GL. So the idea would be to create that visibility from a consumption and unit price perspective. So you would start off with your consumption forecast, and then you would go to unit prices. So in this example, we looked client at 12 sites across South Africa. This is one standardized commodity that procured at different prices. So it's basically the exact same thing that's being procured at a different price. So it would make sense to go to the best price within the organization, which was 309, and then move all your commodity spend to that line. You're removing all the inefficiencies from 367 and 328 in order to get to 309, and then going at the optimal consumption as well. Again, we did this for every commodity within. So this would be an example where we have one GL line item that's made up of 5 commodities. So we would look at each commodity differently. They would all behave very differently. They've got very different causes for why they exist. They've got a very different impact on revenue and profitability. But it's very important to create this enhanced visibility where you can actually look at what are you consuming, why are you consuming this, and what is your best price that you should be paying for this commodity. Okay, then just a little bit more complex example. So if you consider IT expenses growing from 91
in a linear fashion all the way to 114 million. So there's never a scenario where this expenses will reduce over time. If you look at this perspective, you're always going to apply, or the supplier might always ask for a 6 or 10% increase based on whatever drives their cost. And there would never be an opportunity to reduce that. And even if you do, if you reduce it from this perspective, you might get a short-term result, as we mentioned earlier, because it might be a cut into an area that should not have been cut. So the idea would be to break this 114 million down and understand exactly what is going on in there. So in this example, the 114 million breaks down into these areas. So you can see that, for example, hosting services, application, service management were the biggest 3 contributors to that 114 million. So the idea would be to go into that detail to understand what is driving that cost, why it exists, and how do you understand, how do you create the visibility to actually create that zero base and remove that inefficiency. So for this example, we'll just look at applications. So the first thing we did for applications was to look at what is the breakdown between hardware, software, and FTE, FTE being people. And we found that in applications, there's no software component, there's no hardware or hosting component, it's purely driven by people. The reason I'm using this example is it's quite a good one to show how inefficiencies can be removed. So applications then, just to go back here, you're spending 28 million Rand a year, and it's purely based on people maintaining these applications. So it might be Oracle or SAP or Workday, whatever the case may be, whatever application you're using in your firm. This specific example, they spend 28 million maintaining that from a incident and request perspective. So that is something we can quantify from a utilization, productivity, and efficiency perspective, because it's purely driven by people and what they do. So in the applications example, then we said it's purely driven by FTE, purely people, no hardware, no software. So we created this chart at the bottom that sort of shows productivity and utilization over time. So this would be an example where ZBB does require some modeling and some building some algorithm in order to get to this graph. So we pull data from ServiceNow and we applied the time to resolve and the SLA, as well as how many calls there were, how many incidents there were, how many people responded to that, etc., whatever the case may be. And we found this line for the last 9 months. So we saw that utilization was sitting sort of below 50%, at times even in the 30s. And this is for a very expensive commodity that's costing service that's costing 28 million Rand a year. And it's not actually very efficient if you look at the actual data behind it. So we found that there's a lot to be done here. So we built sort of an algorithm to say that if this were to be purely 100% efficient with no inefficiencies, and you've got the perfect mix of people responding to this, this is what it would look like. So then we can see if it were to be perfectly efficient with no inefficiencies, the cost would move from 28 to about 15 million. So this would be changing the way you contract with a supplier, because you would not be looking at the 114 million overall spend anymore. You would be looking at this line separately, and then you'd be looking at this graph specifically on a monthly basis to say that what is my actual capacity that I need, and what do I need to pay for, and what do I not need to pay for? What do I need to remove from this process? So we then removed all this from the contract, and then secondly, we looked at what are we paying per FTE. So we found that we're actually paying 120,000 per month per FTE, where the market-related FTE rate was about 62,000. So if we also went to 62,000 with the optimal mix of how many people, it actually went down to 7 million. So this specific line item was saving this client 20 million Rand a year, purely by looking at the data that drives this cost. So looking at what is the cause of the cost, getting the data behind it, getting everyone to look at the same dashboard, the same graph, understanding that there's inefficiency, and then removing that from your budgeting process. It actually saved quite a lot of for this client.
So this is a very good example where, like Bernard said in the beginning, this is where, for instance, we have a service provider we could have a service provider that's helping us or resolving any issues for an application. Let's take an example. Oracle, we have
a technical team that helps us if we have Oracle issues, and the team is on site all of the time, but we actually only use them 30% of the time, and we're paying them exorbitant rates or a monthly salary of an average of 120 as opposed to where market is 61. So it gives us the opportunity not just to, like what we did in a legacy planning perspective, take last year's contract and increase it by what the supplier says or increase it by inflation, and then we plan that going forward. But it's taking stock of where we are, what we actually need, and having those conversations, which could then lead to significant savings in the way we in our costs, as well as in the way that we then drive our business going forward. So the cumulative saving is also significant going forward in terms of that.
Exactly. So in this example, this specific client was not in a tech industry. So removing this tech cost from the back office created a lot of opportunity to reinvest that into something in the front office that is actually going to differentiate you. And the reason I'm starting with this example is because, like Ronel said, it's a fairly opaque area, because the maintenance of your applications is not something that you necessarily know what the zero base is. It's something it's very opaque. So it's very easy to create massive margins and markups onto that, because no one really understands what it should cost. And once you get the data and quantify what it should cost, it creates a lot of opportunity to contract differently. So in this example, we used exactly this graph with this algorithm behind it to say that this is what it should be on a monthly basis, and we're not just going to go for 28 blindly and apply an increase to that. Now, an area that is much more transparent would be end-user computing. And end-user computing, everyone is it's a lot more visible, because what this is basically the IT department that is supporting people on the ground. So it's the people that's supporting you from a hardware and software perspective once you have issues. And there's a lot more visibility there, because you can see the people, you can see what they do, and it's very clear. So everyone can sort of exactly see, without even looking, what the productivity is. And in this example, we found that once you pull the data and quantify this to the extent that you did applications, this was actually very productive. It was very competitive. At times, like in May, it was more than 100%, which you would expect, because there's so much visibility and transparency behind IT services that is supporting you physically right next to your desk size support. So that's an example of something that is not as opaque. It's much more transparent, so you actually get to that baseline naturally. And then you would do that for every area that is going to be relevant. But I'm just going to use these two examples for now between applications and end user computing, because they're sort of on different sides of the spectrum. But yeah, but that's about it. So I think that's what we wanted to cover from a practical example perspective.
Bernard, sorry, Alex here. Maybe just to add on there, I think what we see is from a spending trend perspective in a lot of the clients. A lot of focus is on the concerns around the increase in cost for IT, for technology, whilst your people costs also continue to grow, or at least they never go down. And I think what you've shown with the past two examples really speaks to that, and this is also something that can then also assist you in being transparent and showing people where costs come from, and making that direct correlation, so that people don't speculate or make conclusions, but really understand the in-depth considerations when looking at IT as a cost and people, and how it could also drive strategic initiatives, how to actually make these two work much better together.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly what the aim is. So it's about creating that visibility and transparency behind the cost to understand what is the cause of cost and what is its effect on profitability or revenue. And I think most costs can be quantified through some sort of methodology without much data or technology investment, which is just about looking at your cost from one more dimension or two more dimensions or three more dimensions. as opposed to just looking at it from a top-down perspective. So certain areas will be very obviously inefficient once you just take one step back. Other areas like IT might be, you might have to take 2 or 3 steps back to get to that point because it's a bit more complex and opaque, but it is advisable to take those steps in order to understand what that baseline is and not overspend on that and overspend year on year on year on year, because that's how you really sort of get on the wrong side of compound growth.
Agreed. Bernard, before we, I see Andries Kok's hand is up. Before we go to Andries, Augustinus had a comment in the chat box earlier. Can you see that? Should I read it?
No, we can't see it. Will you please read it,
Okay.
Alex?
So he says, good morning. Thanks for the powerful presentation. I really learned a lot. I wanted to ask, how do you deal with emergencies that occur during the budget implementation that have not been provided for?
I think that's a good question. So I think the ZBB process would sort of enhance your ability to deal with emergencies because you might see them ahead of time because you're looking at cost drivers and you're looking at data sort of that's going to inform costs. So I think ZBB will give you an opportunity, sort of give you an early warning sign for these stressful scenarios or stress testing, whatever the case may be. But I think you would be much better served if you're looking at your cost from more dimensions with more transparency to adapt to emergencies than just looking at it from a GL perspective.
And I think just to add to that, exactly that, Bernard. Look, there will always be a chance of some emergencies that we could not see, I think. But if we think about traditional planning methods and looking purely at our GL, the likelihood of missing that is far more than looking at something from a ZBB perspective or even a driver-based perspective, where you're starting to look at what is the underlying factors, what is the need that I have from a business perspective. So you're looking at it, like Bernard said, from more dimensions as opposed to just your GL. So yes, there might still be emergencies that you would not be able to foresee. I think doing it in a different way just gives you that early warning signs where you are able to pick up things more so than what you would have looking purely at your GL.
Then there's a hand from Andries Kok. Andries?
Alex, perhaps whilst Andries is finding his mute button, perhaps just a comment as well. You know, budgeting, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very, very pertinent on the last question that was asked. And Ronel's covered it. You know, whilst you can never, you know, you'll never be 100% bulletproof, right? I mean, that's a given, right? There will be unplanned events, calling force majeure, whatever it might be, which does then bring into the equation, which we haven't really touched on this morning, which is scenario planning. So as Bernard and Ronel have mentioned, you know, with this approach, it allows you to actually stress test your business on different variables and move into the paradigm of what we call scenario planning and stress testing the business, giving that you know what those different levers look like and how they will interact. And again, you know, the idea behind this is to move away from the traditional static budget and planning sort of, you know, process, which generally in most business, and I'd like to get some commentary on this perhaps, most organizations take between 3 and 6 months, right, to do budgeting. Think about that's probably either a quarter or half of your financial year. The budget typically goes through 3, 4, 5, 6 iterations. And think of the cost around just preparing that budget. And generally, the budget is outdated the day that you publish it. So you actually want to move away from that mindset. Otherwise, budgeting typically and planning is typically just a tick box exercise. And again, you know, the question is, if it adds no value to the business, then why even do it? So I just wanted to kind of leave that with you as a thought as well. Maybe, Andries, whilst you're finding your unmute, if you state a question or a statement. Thanks.
Yeah, Grant, if I can come in there, I think you make a great point. So I think part of the reason why the budget or the forecast become outdated so quickly is because it wasn't really
linked to fundamentals in the first place, whereas ZBB will give you the opportunity to link that. So it's more likely that it will not be as outdated so quickly.
Maybe I always fear dead silence. So maybe a question, Ronel, and through you and Bernard, maybe a question to the audience. Has anyone had any experience with this approach to budgeting at this point, or thinking about it, and maybe just some commentary around that, if there is anyone in the audience that has some experience in this?
If I may interrupt before we, while we're waiting for people to mute and unmute, maybe one of the other things that I think is just worth mentioning, because it always comes up, or I've seen it in all of our conversations in the past, right, is the examples that we've shown on the screen has had numerous or had quite a bit of data behind it, giving us that visibility or transparency of what's going on in the business. And obviously the type of insight you get depends on the amount of data that you have available. But that doesn't mean that if you do not have massive amounts of data available, that you can't get efficiencies and benefits from looking at something like ZBB. I think Bernard mentioned earlier, it's sometimes just looking at one or two dimensions more than what you have within your GL. So I just want to mention that so that we don't feel overwhelmed in saying, well, I don't have all of this data available, so I can't give you all of that, which we used in, for instance, a commodities example or in a tech example. It's also looking at understanding what do we have and just deep diving one or two levels more than what we have our GL.
Exactly. I think that's a very important point. So it should not be the data or platform dependent. It's very much a way of thinking and a way of looking at your finances differently. And it's the more data, the better, sure. But if you don't have this massive amounts of data, it's not a deal breaker. It's still very much, it's very much a way of thinking differently.
Bernard, maybe whilst we wait for other questions, from my side, can we perhaps elaborate on the practical implementation of this? How scalable is this ZBB process based on size and complexity of businesses? Is it something that we can implement just for a specific department? Or do we need to look holistically at the entire business? What is your view on that? How best to start this? Whilst I think a lot of people might not be 100% comfortable immediately with such a new concept, how can a person go about to experience this in real time, whilst not having too much of a struggle to get this approved and to get buy-in on this from a business perspective?
I think that's a very relevant question. I think it depends on the extent to which you want to implement, number one, and the larger your organization, the more tricky it'll be. A perfect scenario would be if you can have centralized decision making, which would be best case scenario. You'll have optimal results. But if you think about a government context, you will definitely not get that level of centralized decision making. So you would have to look at certain areas that's likely going to show success. So if you think about the graph we did in the slideshow, we looked at spend from a category perspective. The government might look at their external contracts or external services, which is basically a supply chain, a contract that they are paying, and start the process there. And once there is, from a department perspective, and once you get some momentum, then you can move to roll it out on a broader base. But I think very good question, and I think it depends on to which extent you want to implement and how large your organization is. Like I said, I think centralized decision making is best case scenario. But if it's a government context, I would look at that lens where I'm looking at my, for example, external services, external commodities, for example, a PPE contract, and start the process there, and then move it to other maybe more sensitive areas once there is some momentum.
I think that adds to the example that we had in the beginning, earlier on around in the areas where we have buy-in versus not buy-in. Alex, I think it doesn't all have to, almost want to say Rome wasn't built in a day. It doesn't all have to start today. And if you don't do the whole business today, you can't go ahead. I think as we mature every year, then more and more of it can be rolled out. Even if we start in a holistic view every year, we can improve more and more. Or if you start at a department, the next year you can roll it out to another department or more departments.
Yeah, so I think once, just to get back to our example that this is strategic, top-down and bottom-up, I think the most tricky part might be a government context because it's so big and so much buy-in is going to be needed. But if you think about certain costs lead to job creation and tax revenue growth, whereas other costs don't. So if you, for example, if you started your zero basing on areas that doesn't actually lead to job creation or revenue or tax growth, and then reinvest those areas or those savings into areas that does lead to job creation, for example, social spending or infrastructure spending, whatever the case may be, it's likely that you will get more buy-in over time. Like Ronel said, it's not just about 1 year, it's about multiple periods. So once you sort of get this ball rolling and you set this value creation chain in motion, you're likely to get more buy-in as you go.
Bernard, Andries has typed these questions, I think very, very relevant. He says, does ZBB make provision at all for concepts like life cycle costs, for instance, vehicles, equipment? If you look at repairs versus replacement, one of the other examples he gave is conventional energy versus alternative sources.
Yeah, exactly. I think I'm very glad that question came up. So if you think about, if you go a little more strategically and you think about total cost of ownership in your ZBB process, as opposed to what you're paying on a monthly basis, I think that's a perfect example, because in that example, in terms of repair versus replace, you would not even be looking at the cost necessarily, you'd be looking at that question. And if you look at total cost of ownership, one might be much better than the other, which will inform your budgeting, which is a great example because it's not just applying an increase, you're actually looking at what is my operation, what is going to serve my operation best. And I mean, that's exactly what ZBB is about.
Was the fundamental start looking at what is the need of the business and going 1 or 2 levels more than what we see as the line item on our GL. I think, Andries, that gives us the opportunity to look into exactly things like the conventional energy versus alternative sources. What is the need of our business? What are the driving factors of it today? And how can we change if need be? And what could be the benefit, both from a business perspective, but also from a bottom line perspective, should we consider the one over the other? Of course, we're looking at a more realistic approach, not a GL line item alone or in isolation, or a cost item in isolation. We have, I think, more visibility and more opportunity to go into the granular detail.
Yeah, but I think perfect example that Andries, because I think that's both looking top down and bottom up. Because if you look at total cost of ownership, that's top down, what is best for my organization, and then bottom up, you can just zero base whatever you decide on what is best. So I think great points.
Then another question from Andries. Normally we will do ZBB making use of Excel. Does software like SAP also make provision for ZBB breaking the budget process detail into different components? Maybe if, Bernard, if I may, just this is quite important as well. Andries, ERP systems like SAP, I think that is exactly where ZBB should be used better, making use of the data that SAP does have, which is not necessarily used for budgeting purposes, because we must first normalize that data and understand the holistic impact it has. So I don't think necessarily that the SAP budgeting module does consider for a holistic approach. However, I believe that data, if your data management and data quality is correct in the ERP environment, your business data should assist you in making these holistic views make sense to you and adding additional value.
And if I can add to that point, Alex, you're 100% right that the ERP can help you certainly structure your information and provide a lot more normalized views of it. There's then another whole set of technologies called the EPM tool. SAP's got it, Oracle, etc. And it's those budgeting tools that sit on top of your ERP. And absolutely, all of those are built with almost the capabilities to enable ZBB and your driver-based approaches. They enable scenario modeling, and they're a lot more, they're slightly more difficult to implement upfront, but they're a lot more flexible and agile in supporting ZBB, scenario-based analysis, driver-based, rolling it out to organizations holistically than Excel is. Excel is still a very powerful tool, but it's got its limitations in when you want to do more agile and flexible budgeting. SAP's got a tool, and there are a lot of tools that are also agnostic that don't necessarily need to be SAP. And that's the conversation that we have with clients, especially when they're looking at the ZBB approach. Excel is great to get yourself familiar with the concepts and what you're thinking about. And then very quickly, clients graduate onto one of these EPM tools.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I fully agree. Andries, just added, without mentioning names, is Oracle one of the typical data management tools that you're referring to?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of them. Oracle's one of them. There's a new one called OneStream. Workday have got a tool. And there's what we can do as well is we can share with you an EPM landscape that does a comparison of all of the tools that are out there. There are a lot of new cloud-based tools. There are on-premise tools. So I can share that with you guys, as well as a comparison between the pros and cons of what they do. If that would be useful.
I think that will be very useful. Thank you.
Cool.
Alex, I just want to check if there's any other questions from the panel. I really hope that the session today and the practical examples, as opposed to just a presentation of speaking about the methodology, helped everyone to just understand practically what can be done from a ZBB perspective.
Yeah, no, I don't see any additional questions. I think sharing that EPM landscape, that is something that people say they will appreciate. And then other than that, I think, from my perspective, thank you, Bernard, Ronel, Grant, and the team for really making this very practical. Like you said, just putting slides up is one thing, but showing people practically how it's implemented and the benefits, I think that is what is different to ZBB and what you've showcased here today. And then I would like to encourage the participants to please contact us. Feel free to contact us, any of us, to obtain further information. If you want to have a brief chat or a virtual meeting with the entire team, feel free to do so. And yeah, we look forward engaging with you and hopefully assisting you going forward. This model, if I can call it a model, is very flexible from what I have experienced, and I really believe it's something that each of the organizations that are represented here today can get value from. So looking forward to those conversations. And yeah, hopefully we'll do a follow-up, perhaps Ronel, Bernard, on this session with further information as people ask questions, as people ask for further practical examples. I think that's something that we can consider in 2022. But from my side, thank you to everyone. I hope you got the necessary value. And yeah, be safe and enjoy the holidays, and all the best in your new strategic approach around budgeting. Thanks. Any final comments, Grant, Bernard, Ronel?
Alex, thanks. Thanks for that. And I think to everyone on the call, thank you for your time. We really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you on what can be, considered a scary topic. Certainly, that's not the case. I do believe, and it is certainly, a new way of thinking about business and how business interacts. And again, encourage you to try it, to look at it. I always say start small, end big. Look at areas where you can even parallel the process. Take it, your standard or your typical budgeting approach. Try a couple of areas where you apply the ZBB principles. And have a look at the differential gain that you might land up with. But over and above that, I also want to say thanks very much again, Alex and Mimi, for hosting us and the opportunity to talk to you and your clients. And again, to our team, Bernard and Ronel, thank you very much for your insights and the subject matter expertise, and Charlie for weighing in on the EPM side as well. And like we say, EPM is it's a massive conversation around driver-based planning, budgeting, the tools that are available, the methodologies, and so on. So again, all of these are wrapped into an environment where today business has been asked less around the scorekeeping and caretaking, as we call it, but more pushed, especially in finance, to be that value-added business partner, helping steer that business to sustainability. And we certainly believe that applying a ZBB approach is one element amongst many that finance should be spearheading and leading from the front with. So again, just from my side, thank you very much. And I trust that you will all have a well-deserved break in the coming days and look forward to 2022. And that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Bernard, Ronel?
I just want to say thanks for allowing us to present for the last hour and a half. It's been great, and thanks for everyone's time, and I hope you stay safe over the holidays.
Saying exactly what Bernard said, and I just want to say thank you also for the questions and that we got throughout the session. I think that made it a lot more relevant as well. So thanks for your participation, and enjoy the break for those who can take a break over the December holidays. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, team.
Awesome. Thank you. With that, we close the session. Thank you, everyone. Keep well.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.